Hello friends, this is Grief speaking. Today we're looking at the Disturbing Manga Iceberg, and you can thank Dear Luan for that because they wouldn't stop asking for it. I've actually been wanting to do a horror manga iceberg for a while, and there are several icebergs that have been created. The thing is, they're all pretty different. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some descend from well-known to obscure, which is the iceberg standard, while others get more disturbing the lower down you go. So I'm going to do something a little different here. I've essentially made my own iceberg that's an amalgamation of all the icebergs I've seen, as well as just general research that I've done myself. There's going to be 10 tiers total, and today we're going to cover the first 2. Please bear with me here. The first few tiers are the hardest to put together because there's so much disagreement on what entry should be placed where. But if you don't see something in these 2 tiers that you think should be there, it'll likely be on another tier in the future. Feel free to comment anything you hope to see on the iceberg. That way, if I haven't already, I can include it later on. All that being said, this is going to be one of the biggest icebergs I've done, so let's not waste any more time. This is the Disturbing Manga Iceberg, Part 1. Tier 1, Berserk. Trying to go over the story for Berserk would take all day because this series has been going on for decades at this point. But essentially it follows the adventures of Guts the Swordsman. There are several story arcs, but the series is known for its intense and graphic depictions of violence, as well as its complex and mature themes. It's set in a medieval-inspired world where humans are constantly at war with each other and supernatural creatures such as demons and spirits roam the land, and it's been praised in the genre of grimdark fantasy. Like I said, there's a lot of Berserk content out there, and it can be daunting to get into, but what can I say, it's known as one of the most badass mangas ever written. Gantz. Gantz has a really cool story concept. Essentially, a pair of high school students are struck and killed by a subway train after attempting to save a homeless man on the tracks. After being killed, they find that they've been transported into a Tokyo apartment where they meet other clueless participants in the same situations. The pair soon realize that they're not allowed to leave the apartment. At one end of the room, there's a large black sphere known as the Gantz. It then kind of plays like a video game. The Gantz gives the players missions that consist of killing targets. They're also given suits that have superhuman capabilities and sci-fi style weapons. On successfully completing these missions, they earn points which they can eventually spend on new weapons or even the possibility of being freed from the game. They do have downtime where they return to the normal world in between missions, but if they tell anyone about Gantz, their heads will explode. Like I said, it's a really rad concept and has since been adapted into an anime, video game, and even a live action film. I should probably also mention that the manga is heavy on the violence and gore, which is why it's made it onto this list. Hellsing. Hellsing is a horror manga series about the titular organization Hellsing, which is dedicated to fighting supernatural threats in the world, particularly vampires. The story follows the powerful vampire Alucard, who serves as a member of Hellsing and its primary weapon against other vampires and supernatural creatures. The characters face numerous enemies, including rival vampire factions, religious cults, and government organizations. And of course, all of this featuring graphic violence and horror elements. And I mean graphic. There are some brutal kills and injuries in this series, and I'm all for it. Chainsaw Man. Chainsaw Man is one of those mangas you hear about and go, okay, a man transforms into a chainsaw abomination. Too goofy, they're running out of ideas. Then you read it and it's actually really good. Anyway, it's pretty self-explanatory. A human merges with a devil, giving him chainsaw powers. It's wacky, but in the best possible way. High School of the Dead. High School of the Dead is the quintessential zombie survival manga that follows a group of high school students as they're caught in the middle of a zombie outbreak. It borrows a lot of the themes from standard zombie films such as survival, morality, and the breakdown of society in the face of a crisis, but with the typical manga style and tropes such as fan service. A lot of fan service. Mirai Nikki. Mirai Nikki, aka Future Diaries, is pretty high concept. Basically, the god of space and time begins a game involving 12 people. These 12 are given what are called Future Diaries that can tell the future up to 90 days. The goal of the game is to eliminate the other diary holders. The last survivor is meant to be the replacement for this god. This manga has been praised for its intricate plot and character development, as well as its exploration of complex psychological themes. But why is it so disturbing? Well, the series deals with some very heavy subject matter. One of the diary holders is a straight-up terrorist responsible for several bombings, including one that kills kids. There's of course some graphic violence, as well as some pretty intense depictions of sexual assault. So yeah, it can get heavy. Elfen Lied. Elfen Lied is a dark fantasy and psychological horror manga series that revolves around a genetically modified species called the Diclonius, who possess telekinetic powers and are hunted by the government. The story is centered around Lucy, a Diclonius who is initially kept in captivity but escapes and becomes a fugitive. She is pursued by the government agents who seek to eliminate all of her kind, and by a young man named Kota, who becomes caught up in the conflict. This manga really doesn't pull any punches. The first chapter entails Lucy's escape from the facility, and she just straight up wrecks everyone with her psychic powers. It's really cool, and the series doesn't let up from there. I should probably point out that Elfenlied is German for elf song. Just thought you should know. Claymore. Claymore is a dark fantasy manga series that takes place in a medieval-like world where humans are terrorized by shape-shifting demons called Yoma. In order to combat the Yoma, an organization known as the Claymore was created, consisting of women who are part human and part Yoma, possessing extraordinary strength and regenerative abilities. The main protagonist of the series is Claire, a young Claymore who seeks revenge against the powerful Yoma who killed her family when she was a child. Along with her fellow Claymores, she travels from town to town fighting Yoma and protecting humans while struggling with her own inner demons and the constant threat of becoming a full Yoma. The Yoma are pretty brutal, and the series doesn't hold back on the violence. There's one particular chapter where an awakened being, which is a Yoma that's fully transformed and evolved into a more powerful and dangerous form, sticks his phallic-shaped tongue into a character's guts, and something about that just makes me squirm. I don't know, man. Corpse Party. Corpse Party is a fan-favorite Japanese horror game where a group of high school students experience an earthquake that transports them to some kind of alternate dimension where they're stalked by the souls of people who have previously been trapped there. The game has had several manga adaptations which give more detail to some of the more disturbing imagery. Tomie. Tomie is a manga by Junji Ito and is actually his first published work. It revolves around the character Tomie, who possesses an irresistible charm and manipulative power over men. She drives them to acts of violence and jealousy, leading to brutal confrontations and even death. Women are also affected by her, often driven to madness. Tomie is killed repeatedly, but her regenerative abilities allow her to come back to life and spread her curse to other victims, making her effectively immortal. Her origins are never really explained, but she's hinted to have existed long before the events of the manga. Each chapter serves as a different story where different characters encounter Tomie in her various forms, some with their own arcs and returning in later chapters. Tomie's regenerative abilities, partly fueled by cannibalism and assimilation, are showcased as she can quickly recover from mortal wounds and replicate herself by sprouting unnaturally from any part of her body. Radiation accelerates her healing process, and her cells can transform a victim into a Tomie via an organ transplant. Even dismembering her corpse can unwillingly allow more Tomie copies to grow and spread. Locks of her hair are even dangerous and can burrow into victims' brains to possess them. Even if Tomie's body is not injured, it will attempt to sprout another Tomie through tumorous growths when emotionally stressed. Fire is the only method to destroy Tomie for good, but only if the flesh is completely carbonized. Uzumaki. Speaking of Junji Ito, we might as well talk about Uzumaki, probably the most well-known or at least one of the most popular of his works, and for good reason. It's really good. It follows the strange events that begin to happen in a small town as people begin to obsess over the shape of a spiral. There's way too much to cover, but essentially every chapter deals with some different supernatural horror, like students turning into snails, bodies contorting into spiral shapes, and one of my personal favorites, a maternity ward gone mad. It just keeps becoming more and more bleak as the town descends into pure chaos. This eventually escalates into cosmic horror territory, but I won't spoil any of it because I really think you should just go and read it. It's a masterpiece. Goblin Slayer. Goblin Slayer is a really gritty, dark fantasy manga centering around the titular Goblin Slayer on his quest to kill every goblin he comes across. The world of Goblin Slayer is very similar to that of Dungeons & Dragons, where bands of adventurers set off to complete quests. There's even an interesting Easter egg where the adventurer sign-up sheet looks very similar to a typical D&D character sheet. Anyway, in this world, goblins are a very common nuisance, attacking villages and stealing their women to use as sex slaves. A young and naive priestess joins a group of new adventurers who plan on taking out a cave of goblins, but underestimates them and the entire party gets wiped out, and death isn't even the worst part. Two of the women in the party are mercilessly taken advantage of while they lay dying. It's really brutal. But right before the young priestess has the same fate, Goblin Slayer shows up and just destroys these goblin mofos. Thus begins Goblin Slayer. I like the mystique around Goblin Slayer and the fact that he doesn't even have a real name. He just calls himself Goblin Slayer. That's awesome. It's a horrific manga at times, mostly because of the graphic violence done to both the adventurers and the goblins themselves, as well as the horrible things the goblins do to women. Gyo. Gyo, meaning fish, is another Junji Ito manga. This one is about a couple who go to an island on vacation when they encounter a fish with legs. Soon they discover all manner of marine life with legs crawling out of the sea, including a great white shark which attacks them. They eventually escape the island, but the horde of walking creatures now begin to overrun Tokyo. They discover that this is a product of research into a virus during World War II that causes its host to produce a deadly and repulsive stench, in a desperate effort to turn the tide of war. They created the legs as a mechanism to send the virus across enemy lines. That is one of the most wild premises I've ever heard, but that's what's so great about it. Like, who else would come up with this stuff? Devilman. Devilman's a manga released back in 1972 and has since become one of the most purchased mangas of all time. The story revolves around a high school student named Akira who learns that demons are planning to wipe out humanity. Akira merges with a demon named Amon, becoming Devilman, and must fight to protect humanity from the demonic threat. This manga is very gruesome and just chock full of blood and gore and boobs. Lots of boobs. The real disturbing stuff comes from the demons and their transformations, usually changing the human body into grotesque abominations. This may seem on par with a lot of horror today, but imagine seeing this back in 1972. Shout out to the author Go Nagai, a true trailblazer in this kind of imagery. Gakkou Gurashi. This is an interesting one. It follows a group of high school girls who live in their school as they survive through a zombie apocalypse. One of the interesting things about this manga is the character Yuki. Initially, she appears to be completely naive and unaware of the zombie outbreak. However, she's actually suffering from mental illness caused by the traumatic event of losing her friends and being trapped in the school during the outbreak. In order to cope with the trauma, Yuki's created a delusion in which everything is still normal and her friends are still alive. The other characters who are trying to survive and come to terms with the reality of the situation go along with Yuki's delusion in order to protect her. It creates an interesting dynamic between Yuki and the other characters, and it's interesting to see how Yuki comes up with some rationalization for everything being thrown into chaos. Parasite. Parasite originally released in 1988, but I actually only found out about it recently thanks to the body horror Iceberg I did. Since then, it's become one of my favorites. It follows a teenage boy, Shinichi, who contracts a parasitic creature. The creatures climb into human ears and take control of the brain, and thus the entire body. Shinichi, however, has headphones in when the parasite attempts to crawl into his ear, and with limited time to survive, it crawls into his arm instead. This parasite, which Shinichi names Migi, can now only control his right arm, and this is how a strange relationship begins, as both need the other to survive. The parasite-controlled humans blend into society, but secretly must feed on people, causing widespread panic as more and more decimated corpses are found. The relationship between Migi and Shinichi is what makes the series great. Migi is so void of emotion and only thinks in a purely logical way without any specific moral guidelines other than survival. This often runs up against Shinichi's sense of basic morality and emotional impulses, which leads to some funny and disturbing moments. Shinichi and Migi also constantly run into other parasites which they have to battle. The parasites have the ability to transform their bodies in any way they see fit, including turning into sharp objects, which is usually how they fight. Shinichi starts off with a disadvantage because only his arm can transform. However, eventually he and Migi begin to integrate more, and Shinichi himself develops superhuman strength, speed, and lightning-fast reflexes, making him much more formidable against the other monsters. Okay, I've rambled too much on this one. What can I say? I really like it. Tier 2. Mahou Shoujo of the End, also known as Magical Girl Apocalypse, hits the ground running and never stops. The story begins with a high school student named Kogami as he narrates his boring life. Suddenly he sees a strange-looking girl with a mallet show up and start massacring his entire class, and I mean tearing everybody apart in a truly gruesome manner. Everyone who's killed by the magical girl come back as zombie-like creatures with immense strength. Basically, the apocalypse has begun and Tokyo is thrown into chaos by these magical girls. From there, Kogami and a band of fellow students attempt to survive and navigate the magical girls who all have different abilities. I think what makes this one so disturbing isn't just the violence, which, don't get me wrong, some of the deaths are extremely brutal and creative, but the fact that you never know who will die. Sometimes you'll meet a new character that you assume will be around for the entire journey, only to see them get killed off 2 pages later. It's actually what makes it so exciting, especially in those first few chapters where it's just chaos, blood, and confusion. The story gets more complex as they learn more about these magical girls and their origin. Definitely a cool one to check out. Dead Man Wonderland. Dead Man Wonderland is set in a futuristic Japan where a massive earthquake has destroyed most of Tokyo and created a new city which has been built around a privately owned prison called Dead Man Wonderland. It follows a teenage boy named Ganta who is a survivor of the earthquake and is falsely accused of murdering his entire class by a mysterious figure known as the Red Man. He's sentenced to death and sent to Dead Man Wonderland, where he's forced to participate in a deadly game called the Carnival Corpse, which is a gladiator-style battle where prisoners known as Dead Man fight to the death for the amusement of paying visitors. Each Dead Man has a special power known as a branch of sin, which is unique to each individual, but typically involves the manipulation of their own blood. Ganta soon discovers that he has the power to control his own blood as well. Mermaid Saga. This is a weird one. Mermaid Saga is based around the idea that if you eat the flesh of a mermaid, you have a chance of becoming immortal, but on the flip side, you also have the chance of dying or being transformed into a deformed monster called a Lost One. The story follows a young man named Yuta who is immortal and has lived for over 500 years. He's become tired of his immortality and is seeking a way to become mortal again. He encounters a young woman who recently ate mermaid flesh and has become immortal as well. Together they travel around encountering other immortal souls who share their stories from different eras. There's a lot of disturbing imagery in this one, especially for 1984, and it has a similar art style to Devilman. Battle Royal. Battle Royal is set in a dystopian Japan where, as a result of an economic collapse, the government has adopted the Battle Royal Act, which selects a class of high school students randomly and forces them to fight to the death on a deserted island. The purpose of this act is to intimidate the population into submission and reduce juvenile delinquency. The story follows the class selected to participate in the Battle Royal program as they're sent to the island, given weapons, and told they must kill each other until one person remains. The students are issued survival packs and a random weapon/tool and sent out onto the island one by one. While most of the students receive guns and knives, some acquire relatively useless items like boomerangs, darts, or a fork. They have metal collars around their necks that will explode if they attempt to remove them or stay in any forbidden zones. They initially struggle with the idea of killing their friends and classmates, but as the game progresses, they become ruthless in their efforts to survive. The concept alone is pretty disturbing, but watching these underage kids devolve into madness, suffering horrible injuries and trauma, can at times be hard to stomach. A couple things worth noting. One is that there are obviously some striking similarities to the Hunger Games, and people have tried to say that Hunger Games ripped off the concept. I personally think it's just parallel thinking, especially since the settings are so different, but you can judge that for yourself. On another note, Battle Royal has one of the most well-received film adaptations of a manga, which I would definitely recommend. Quentin Tarantino also famously praised the film, saying it was the best film he'd seen in the past 2 decades, and stating that if there's any movie that's been made since I've been making movies that I wish I had made, it's that one. Damn, that's high praise. Blood on the Tracks. Blood on the Tracks is disturbing in a completely different way. It dives into psychological horror and abusive relationships. It follows a young boy, Seiichi, as he navigates his home and social life. His mother's very overprotective and controlling to the point that it's actually scary, and there's a slew of dark family secrets that have traumatized Seiichi, who's suppressed a lot of these memories. I'm being kind of vague here because the story is great at slowly revealing shocking truths. I would recommend reading the first few chapters because it just keeps this constant intensity that makes you feel like something weird is going on and leads up to a really shocking moment that I don't want to spoil, but it sets up the whole thing very well. Homunculus. Homunculus is a psychological horror manga about a homeless man named Suzumu Nakoshi who volunteers to participate in a strange medical experiment for 700,000 yen. The experiment involves drilling a hole into his skull, which is supposed to tap into his sixth sense and develop a third eye, which grants him the ability to see people's innermost desires and fears. This manifests as what are called homunculus, where he sees the bodies of these people take strange and deformed shapes. He uses this new power to delve deeper into his own psyche and the people he encounters. The unsettling nature of the story comes from the exploration of the human psyche, as well as the grotesque imagery and violence that occurs throughout the manga. Just a side note, this process of drilling a hole in someone's head is called trepanation, and it was an actual medical practice at one point in history. I Am a Hero. I Am a Hero follows Hideo Suzuki, an unassuming 35-year-old manga artist. Hideo seems to have some mental health issues and hallucinates strange people in his apartment, which is really creepy. But his life takes a dark turn when a mysterious virus starts to spread in Tokyo, turning people into violent, zombie-like creatures. Yeah, this is another zombie manga, but I Am a Hero has a completely different feel than the others I've mentioned so far. It's much more realistic and avoids a lot of the typical manga tropes. The art style, the character interactions, and even how the people actually look like real people make this one stand out. It does have a bit of a slow start, but once the shit hits the fan, this one gets very dark very quickly. The infected people don't just act like shambling zombies you might see in a typical zombie movie. Their skin becomes all veiny and gross looking, and they contort their bodies in strange and unsettling ways. Hideo having to navigate these creatures while his psyche slowly breaks down makes this a very anxiety-inducing and disturbing read. Zekyo Gakyu. This translates to screaming lessons. Every chapter tells a different horror story concerning a class of students. It's sort of an anthology series like Twilight Zone or Black Mirror, where a different story and threat is told every chapter. These stories are narrated by a ghost girl named Yomi, who bookends each chapter by both setting up and summarizing the lesson each chapter teaches. Also, Yomi is just a floating torso, which is a pretty cool reveal at the end of chapter 1. Another is a horror mystery manga that's set in a small town where a high school student named Koichi transfers to. He soon discovers that his class has a strange and eerie atmosphere and that his classmates seem to be hiding a dark secret. Koichi becomes especially interested in a weird girl named Mei, who is always wearing an eye patch and appears to be ignored by everyone else in the class. So as the story progresses, Koichi begins to experience supernatural events and discover that a curse has been haunting his class for many years. Each year someone in the class dies under mysterious circumstances, and their existence is erased from the memories of the other students and faculty. Koichi and Mei team up to investigate the curse and try to break it before it claims more victims. Along the way, there are some genuinely shocking twists and gnarly deaths. Gegege no Kitaro, also known as Kitaro of the Graveyard. This manga was released in the 60s and has had a significant cultural impact in Japan, with many of its characters and concepts becoming well known in Japanese society. It follows a young yokai boy named Kitaro. Kitaro is the last surviving member of his clan of yokai who was born with one eye. He has the ability to communicate with both humans and yokai and uses his powers to protect both groups from evil yokai who seek to harm them. Along with his father and a group of yokai friends, Kitaro travels throughout Japan to solve various supernatural mysteries and fight against malevolent yokai. Because it'll be relevant throughout this iceberg, I'll give a quick explanation of yokai. So, yokai are a big part of Japanese folklore. They're basically spirits, demons, or monsters that have various traits and appearances. Demon and monster kind of have a different meaning in Japan, or at least they lack the negative connotation, because yokai aren't always necessarily evil. Sometimes they're just mischievous tricksters, and other times they're peaceful, like Kitaro in this story. One thing I found fascinating is the lore that this manga builds. In the first issue, Kitaro's father explains that the world was once full of yokai and that humans came along and drove them into caves where they slowly starved. It's an interesting mythology and a cool start to the story. Speaking of Kitaro's father, he's one of my favorite characters because his mummy-like body withers away, but one of his eyeballs falls out and then grows its own little body. So he's just this little eyeball creature, usually hitching a ride on Kitaro. I love it. This one is definitely worth checking out, if anything, for how significant an influence it's had on Japanese horror. Alright, we did it folks, 2 tiers down, 8 to go. This has already been a lot of fun, and it just gets crazier from here. I mean, spoiler alert, but some of the entries on the bottom tiers literally made me feel sick. So, you can look forward to that, I guess. Shout out to my patrons for all of the support. Naomi Romero, Soma, and Krusty the Crab, you guys are awesome. If you want a shout out like that at the end of every video, as well as a bunch of other bonus content, check out my Patreon, the link's below. But as always, I appreciate you watching at all, so thank you. This is Grief speaking. Goodbye, friends.